Welcome to Creative Imperfections. I'm Kelly, and I am so glad you're here. Think of this podcast as your safe place to be your beautifully messy self. Let's dive in. Today, I want to talk about a subtle shift that happens to so many creatives over time. And it's usually something that begins so small and so quiet that you don't even notice that it's happening. At the beginning of a creative journey, most people are simply creating. They perform, they experiment, they explore ideas, and they follow what feels interesting or exciting without thinking too much about how they compare to anyone else. There's a kind of freedom in those early stages because the focus is on discovery rather than evaluation. But eventually, something changes. You begin to look around and notice how other people are doing things. You observe how others present themselves, how they brand their work, how they perform, and how they seem to succeed. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with learning from others, the mind has a funny way of slowly turning observation into comparison. And without realizing it, you start adjusting. At first, maybe you soften certain parts of your personality. Maybe you begin emphasizing the traits that seem more acceptable or more marketable. Perhaps you find yourself trying to sound a little more like someone who appears to have figured everything out. After all, if someone else has discovered what works, it feels reasonable to assume that following a similar path might lead to similar results. The more you try to sound like everyone else, the more your work begins to lose the very thing that made it interesting in the first place. Your difference. Imagine an orchestra for a moment. Within that orchestra, you have violins, trumpets, flutes, cellos, drums, each carrying a distinct tone and emotional texture. A trumpet can fill a room with bold, commanding energy, while a violin can hold something delicate and expressive. A drum can create rhythm and momentum that moves everything forward. Now imagine what would happen if every instrument in that orchestra tried to sound the same. If the violins tried to imitate the trumpet, if the drums tried to mimic the flute, if the cellos tried to match the violins, the results would never be harmony. It would be confusion and chaos. The richness and depth that makes music compelling would disappear. Music works precisely because each instrument leans into its nature instead of trying to become something else. And creative work operates in much the same way. And yet, many creatives spend years trying to become a slightly altered version of someone else. They watch what works for others and assume they should replicate it, often believing they need the same tone, the same style, or even the same personality in order to succeed. But people rarely remember sameness. They remember presence. They remember the moment someone felt real. This is especially true in performing arts, in voiceover, where authenticity often matters far more than technical perfection. When casting directors listen to auditions, they're not simply searching for the most polished or flawless read. Instead, they're listening for something much more human and much harder to manufacture. They're listening for truth. They are listening for that moment when it sounds like a genuine thought just occurred, when the words feel less like a performance and more like a person speaking. And that truth doesn't sound identical from one person to the next. Some voices naturally carry warmth and openness, while others bring grounded authority or quiet confidence. Some actors bring humor and playfulness, while others carry a subtle emotional depth that allows a script to breathe in a completely different way. These differences are not obstacles. They are the instruments. But comparison has this way of convincing us otherwise. It whispers that our instrument isn't quite right, that we should smooth out the edges, adjust the tone, shape ourselves into something that feels safer and more familiar, something comfortable. And that's often when the creative process starts to weigh on you, because the further you move away from your natural voice, the more effort it takes to sustain. Instead of responding honestly to the moment, you begin thinking about how you should sound, how you should present yourself, how you should perform. And audiences can feel that shift, even if they can't quite explain why. The irony is that the qualities you have been trying to soften or hide may actually be the most interesting parts of your work. Whether you're in performance arts, visual arts, music, writing, anything creative. Maybe it's the rhythm of your speech that feels uniquely conversational. Maybe it's the emotional sensitivity that allows you to connect deeply with a story. These things are not mistakes. They're like fingerprints. No one else carries the exact same combination of experiences, instincts, humor, perspective, and emotional memory that you do. And those qualities inevitably shape the way you interpret a line, tell a story, paint a picture, connect with an audience. The world doesn't need more identical voices. It needs real ones. Sometimes the most powerful shift in a creative career doesn't come from learning something new. Sometimes it comes from giving yourself permission to stop sanding down the parts of yourself that make you distinct. Think about some of the artists or actors or storytellers that you admire most. Chances are they didn't become memorable by blending in with everyone else. Instead, they leaned into something authentic, something that sounded unmistakably like them. Your difference is not something you have to overcome in order to succeed. In many cases, it's the very reason your work will resonate with someone. And that brings us back to the heart of what this podcast explores again and again. Creative work is rarely about polishing yourself into perfection. More often than not, it's about embracing the imperfect edges that make your work human. Because within those imperfect edges, there is something honest, something personal, something that can't be replicated or replaced. And that is the thing your audience will respond to. Not perfection, but presence. Your voice, your perspective, your way of seeing the world. That is the instrument you were given, no matter your medium. And the more you lean into it, the more interesting the music becomes. Thank you for listening to Creative Imperfections. Always remember, there's magic in the mess. If you enjoyed this episode, share it, subscribe, and keep showing up for your beautifully imperfect journey. Until next time.